In this video, I'm just going to go over how to make some simple jewelry box trays or trays for anything. You don't have to have the jewelry box. I don't go over the jewelry box, and I also won't be going over building the spline jig. If people are interested and I need to make another one sometime, I can do that. It's a very simple mitered, splined, and then dividers. I went with the simpler route of dividers, and instead of putting grooves in the side, we just set the dividers in on their own and glue them down. There's some tear out issues you can have with doing the grooves and the dividers, and I didn't want to put that too much onto people in a single video, especially if you're new. So we're just going to go through how to make these every step. This video is extremely detailed, every step in microscopic detail. So if you're looking for a quick hits kind of thing, this probably isn't right for you. But if you've either never made some before, you're new to woodworking, or you're struggling to make them, feel free to give this a check out. I will put some timestamps to try to highlight some of the key points to help you out. So to build these drawers for this jewelry box, we're going to obviously need the wood that we intend to make the drawers and the dividers out of. Now I've gone ahead and planed these down in resaw. They were taken from this piece of cherry right here. You can see, interestingly, the color change between a piece that's been sitting and when it's freshly planed. What I will say is if you don't have a planer, generally smaller little inside drawers, I don't want to say delicate, but you know, the aesthetic of a jewelry box, a little bit delicacy in the drawers is really nice. But obviously a lot of people don't have a planer or a drum sander. So places like Home Depot, whatnot, and probably even your lumber yards sell thinner pieces already. I know Home Depot sells 1/2 inch pieces. I think this is about 3/8, but 1/2 inch would look perfectly fine depending upon the thickness of your box itself. I took these down to 3/8. It's a good look relative to this, so we're gonna go with that. So we're gonna need all of the pieces that are gonna make our drawers and the dividers ahead of time, the same thickness, and ideally from the same species, of course. I also like to have a test piece, because one thing about drawers is there's a very fine line between too tight and too loose. I like to get them such that there's almost an air pocket, that when you put it in, they kind of sink down on a bed of air. And when you pull them out, there's a little bit of suction, but it prevents you from yanking it out. So we want to go pretty tight, but leave a little under an eighth, a little over a 16th total gap here to get that. And also we have to be careful of any expansion. You know, it's a little bit of a conundrum in the summer, but you should be fine as long as you leave 16th to an eighth of an inch. If you're doing this outside, closer to an eighth. So we really want to test before we cut into this. Now the first thing you're going to want to do, if you've got a sliding lid box or any box that has a lid that goes through, determine your height here and determine the size of each tray. Now the way I do these trays is I insert the base into it, which means I lose some of my depth. However, from building past jewelry boxes, what I will say is that a tray that's too deep actually becomes hard to reach into, especially if their compartments are small and you have tiny earrings in there. So you may be inclined to want to make them higher. Don't always do that. Grab, if you have a wife, a girlfriend, something like that, partner, grab some of their jewelry. If you're making it as a gift, do it sneakily. And just kind of test the size and see what it's like. Because a watch, you may need a little more height, but tiny little earrings, very difficult to get your fingers in there if this is too high. This is a little over 2 inches up until where the lid slides in. So both of these are going to be just under 1 inch. Just to buy myself a little room in case the bottom of this box changes at all. So I'm going to cut these down. For the sides of the drawers, I want to use personally this more reddish area. We've got some sapwood here, but that'll be either for the dividers or if I have enough, not at all. So I'm going to cut these down, and we're going to start out by taking our dimensions this way and this way to get a rough idea of where to cut these. And we want to cut a little over, and then when we go to cut the miters, we're going to trim it down a little bit by bit. If you like to live dangerously, you can try to get the dimensions perfectly right from the beginning, but this test piece is very helpful in determining how hard they are to pull out. If you only have one tray and it's not getting pulled out, then it doesn't matter, make it as tight as you want. Or in fact, I would just put dividers alone in there. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these down, and I'm going to cut them all into 1-inch strips, and then we'll go and do the miters from there. Alright, so I've got all the 1-inch pieces. Each of these are for a drawer. My internals are a maximum of 11 3/4 by 6, so 2 walls, and then each of these I cut it so that I'll be able to get an end from each of these. Now, what I suggest doing here is leaving your walls, assuming this piece is relatively close to where you're going to work down to, leave the long walls staying there. We'll just cut the miters down, and then leave as much room as you can for these. I'm going to just split it in the middle. This is like 13. It's much safer, in my opinion, to nibble down doing the miters than to try to get this perfect and then miter it. One thing that can be really interesting with little jewelry box drawers is if you have a continual grain pattern around. Now from these, I'm not going to be able to do it because these were taken just out of a single chunk. I don't have enough going this way. But if you have a longer, thinner piece, consider taking a side, an end, and then a side and an end, and it will look like a single continuous piece that wraps around. And you have to ensure early on that you mark everything out so that you don't get lost. So at this stage right here, if you are doing some kind of waterfall, whatever you want to call it, there's a name for it, I can't remember. Lay out all your pieces now, mark them out so that when you're cutting the miters. And another thing I suggest is that when you're laying these out, let's say these two are going to go end to end, and this is going to be the end, and this is going to be the long side. Mark 1 and 1 here so that you know that the first miters you're going to cut are going to be from this end, and they will be just as little as you can take off to get the miter, and then you can trim the length from the other sides. That way this corner becomes a perfect match. Just plan ahead on this. It's a beautiful look if you have the piece of wood to do it, but you have to think ahead. And you have to plan ahead, and at all times keep in your mind which parts you're cutting from so that you ensure you lose as little as possible from the corners. Alright, now that I've got my pieces, I'm just going through and kind of looking at them and finding what I think is the best look. Obviously this isn't going to be any kind of waterfall pattern. God, I can't remember the name for the life of me of that. Somebody in the comments tell me. And I'm deciding what side I like up. These kind of have a little medullary ray quarter sawn action. I think that looks cool. I'm looking for the darkest side on the outside, and because I have 2 of these, I like to go ahead and I like to mark up, and I like to mark out, and then I like to number the corners, and on miters, I like to go ahead of time and draw, doesn't have to be perfect or in the right spot, the angle, so that I know when I'm on the table saw which way needs to be cut. It's very important to do this ahead of time, or else you can get to the table saw, get lost, and you'll have suddenly the inside on the outside, and you won't have any length left to play with. I'm a big fan of numbering, lettering, writing all over wood so that you don't get lost at any point. Mineral Spirits takes off pencil pretty quickly from relatively close-grained wood, close-pore wood. So don't try to erase it. That can just rub it in, get some Mineral Spirits, just wipe it, and then anything left, a little swipe of sandpaper. So I'm going to go ahead and number all these. I'm going to draw all my corners, which again I think are very important. And you will know you will have it right if your corners, both lines, should line up, going this way and this way. That way you'll know it. You can also then put a 1 and a 2 if you want to cut this corner as little as possible, and then take the length from this side. All of these little things to help you remember maybe the next day exactly what you wanted to do when you're planning this the night before. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is set up the saw to cut the miters. I just want to make note, if you have one of these are very useful but also not particularly accurate. And when I say that, I mean within a half a degree or a degree, they can be off. And you'll notice that if you change which way they're on there, sometimes it won't always read the same. So these are very helpful. It's worth it at 30-ish bucks or whatever. Get one, but I always make test cuts. I just have a piece of pine I keep around, and I start out quite long, and then just every time I want to cut miters, I cut a little bit off of each side until I get it right. Now, some people may scoff at the idea of taking that time, but I get miters that I really like, so that's just what I do. If you're struggling to get your table saw set up correctly, do test cuts. The only way you can truly know is to form the full box out of whatever cheap wood you have, and if they all close nicely and they all close nicely on the side, it's perfect. You're also going to want to use the highest tooth count table saw blade you have. Now in my case that's a 60. 60 and above is generally preferable. I think 50s, you know, they're okay, but I still think they leave a little too much of a mark. And they'll glue together, it's fine. It just doesn't always leave the cleanest finish for the glue surface. Now, if you're a hand tool person and you're good with hand planes, make yourself a mitered shooting board, and you will have better miters than any of us because you will be able to clean it up perfectly. So if you're into that and you're into hand planes, make yourself a mitered shooting board if you plan on doing mitered boxes. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this up, and then we'll get into cutting them. All right, just something I want to note, and I pointed out this in another video, is that these need to be straight up and down at 90 degrees to the table. So you can see if you're at a slight angle at all, it changes the angle of the blade, which you would not think. But when you're straight up and down, it will read accurately, or as accurate as it can. And then I would also suggest zeroing it out to both sides and then checking it whatever way you wish. But just zero it out both ways and try it back and forth, and you'll eventually get 45-45. All right, I've got everything set up here. I built this the other day out of an old sled that I was disassembling. We'll see how long it lasts. It's pretty janky, but I think it'll work for now, and I'm just having a little fun with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to cut one side of all of these at a time, and then we'll come back later and refine the length using our test pieces within the box so we can see how they fit. But I'm just going to go ahead and cut one side to all of these. If you are getting tear out because you don't have any kind of like zero clearance, you can do two things. One, take a 1/4 inch piece of plywood and just connect it to this so that it's a brand new face. Or what I like to do is I like to take some blue tape and I just put a little bit right where the cut's going to be, because our tear out is going to come on this back corner. So just a little bit of blue tape, I just break it into little chunks right on the back edge there, on the cutting edge. That'll help. It won't be perfect, it won't work every time, but it'll help. And the reason we start out a little long is so that if we get a little tear out, we can scoot over and over. Now, when we are cutting dimensions for our box and we're doing miters, we have to remember the dimensions are going to be from the outside points, but because the blade is at an angle, that means the entrance point will be further back. So when you're measuring, do not cut at the bottom of where this is with the top of your line. I hope that makes sense. Basically, if you want to get it close, it'll take you a while. Let's say my top is there. That needs to be on the peak cutting point. The blade will actually be entering somewhere down here, but that is not my measurement. My measurement is here, and we will line it up so that the cutting begins at the bottom of this. It's a little, you got to get used to it if this is your first time of kind of figuring out where the blade's going to cut. If you have zero clearance, that's perfect. It'll show you exactly where it is anyways. If you do your first piece, and this will change for every thickness, take a note of where it is and just draw a little mark right there. And you know every time that you just have to go to that point, and that'll make it a lot quicker. But for the first time or two, you're going to have to play with how far over based on the thickness of the piece of wood, because our saw blade will be raised or lowered based on that. Now I like to set the saw blade for miters so that the tooth is above the piece of wood. Somebody once told me, or I heard online or something, that coming down reduces tear out instead of going through. I have no idea if that's actually true, but I've done it. I usually get away without too much tear out using the blue tape. So I always just set it so that a tooth is above the wood. Not a bunch, just a little bit. In the past, I've done it at all different angles, and I've had success and failures at all different heights up, but now I just do the tooth above. Another thing I really like to do is to use a stop block for every cut. When the blade is at an angle, sometimes it has this propensity to almost want to push the piece away. And because this cut is so specific and important, I like to have a backer to just make sure that can never happen. That way I only have to focus on holding it down instead of holding it from any pressure that's going this way. So consider just clamping on some kind of stop block every cut. Alright, I got the initial miter on every piece, and I put one on each test piece as well. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in, and this will depend on what type of box yours is. Mine is a sliding lid, so I can sit nicely here. But if not, you'll just sit on top, which I'll have to do here. And we're going to make an initial mark. Now, because we know that the drawer is going to have to be a little smaller than this, that's a good place to start. Now remember, you're going to go up, and then your 45 will actually be somewhere over here. If you have a tri-square, you can just draw it out, and you'll get a good idea of where your saw blade is going to have to line up when you cut to save yourself, A, from an error of cutting too far, or having to do a bunch of cuts because you're too far away. This usually takes me 3 cuts on each direction to get it just right. And know that we will be sanding the trays later, so they will get a little smaller even. You don't want them to be able to roll around in there. You want to be able to pick the piece up and down without having to kind of like fight your way out. But you don't want it to be rolling back and forth too much. You should be able to pick it up, possibly even with one hand, but you shouldn't have to worry about it rolling. That's the best kind of way I can describe it, is one hand should be able to pick it up and out, because if you're going to have a tray, maybe you want to pick it up and out with one hand, but you don't want it rattling back and forth too much. There will be space, it will be able to move, but not too much. So I'm going to go ahead and do my first test cut here, and once I get this close, I'll have my stop block, and I will then make the cut on all my other pieces. And in case there is tear out, I've left a little meat on the bone, which then I will finesse this down to exactly the size I want and then make the final miter. Again, this is a lengthy process for me, but I get really good results, and so I take the time to do it. You may be able to one-shot this and not worry about tear out or anything, but I just don't want to take that risk. So I take my time. You know, it's too long if you're trying to make 1,000 of these, obviously, but I'm not. I'm trying to make one. Don't forget that if you have your miter on this side, you are not going to want to flip this around. You want to keep it up. Your miters will always be up if your saw blade is tilting this way. So don't forget that and accidentally place it like this. Make sure it's always up and that you're always looking at it from the outside facing in. One more thing I want to note about miters and how well the box is going to close is that it's very important that the edge you are placing against here, as well as this edge, that they are straight, that this is jointed well, whether you do it by hand, on a router, with a table saw jig. If this is wiggling around at all, this angle will not be at 90, even if this sled is at 90. You have to be very careful if you are using Home Depot kind of pine to make a jointing jig and joint this edge first. If you have any wobble in this back and forth, it will not close well when you go to glue up the box. So just really make sure that you shouldn't be able to see any gaps kind of along in here when you're making this cut. Okay, now that I've got them all with their second cut on there, we're just gonna go with this and keep moving it until we find the right spacing. When I get it right, I'll take it over there and I'll show you what I mean by the ability to easily pull it out. I'm really close here, and I just wanted to give you a tip on how to get this over just by a little bit at a time. Things like a business card, packing tape, and blue tape all have different thicknesses. And depending upon how much you need to go over, you can place these between your piece and your stop block. You hold it up against there hard, then you will undo the stop block, remove the card, and scoot it over to the piece of wood. So I just need to go over probably the width of this blue tape or so, maybe blue tape plus packing tape. Sometimes I'll stack these and create a specific thickness. I don't know offhand what their thickness is, but any object really can be a spacer if you don't have a feeler gauge. They make feeler gauges for this purpose, but if you want to buy one, that's fine. So I'm just going to do a little blue and a little packing tape. I'm going to put it between my spacer here. I'm going to undo this clamp. We're going to remove this, and then we're just going to go over it and clamp it back down and do our test cut and see if that's right. Okay, I am real close, probably a business card away or so, but this is what I want to show you as too tight. It can go down in there, but now try to pull this out with one hand and it will probably get stuck. You want to be able to pull it out with one hand without having to twist it at all, because once it's a box, there is no twisting. So this is too tight, even though I can get it out of there after some trying. So shave a little bit off if you're at that point. Okay, so I've got it right. This is what the tightness should look like. I can go in and out. When it's perfectly up and down, I can go in and out, in and out. And this is exactly 11 3/4 interior. And this is just a little over 11 and 11/16. So I didn't take away an entire 16th, but remember, this is also going to be getting sanded, so we will be removing some there as well. But in and out, that's what you want. But at the same time, there's only a little bit of play back and forth. This thing isn't going to go anywhere when it's a box. So that's what you're looking for. And you will just do the same process for the other width-wise. Same test fitting, same sneaking up on it, and then you'll have all your pieces. And then we are going to go on to cutting the base groove, deciding which kind of base we want. Some people prefer a groove. I do. Some prefer to just sit it on the bottom. That's fine. Then we will sand the inside and then glue it together and then get ready for our splines. When I'm doing something this close to the fence, I like to use an auxiliary fence. This is just a piece of melamine that was left over from putting it in my planer or increasing the bed size. Just 2 holes drilled in there and these little clamps. I think these are PowerTech. It was maybe $12, $15 for 2 of them. And on many fences, they work, but on certain ones, there's kind of a... On the DeWalt table saw, if you have that, you'll remember there's that flip over, that narrow rip fence. And in the back, there are also 2 little clips to put the push stick on. I had to remove those, the clips on mine, to get these clamps to fit on the back. So it may take a little fiddling. Obviously, these Biesmeyer fences are nice and open. But this is a really good way to make sure you are not going to damage your fence on your table saw. I do not like taking chances if I don't have to. I would much rather accidentally cut into this than into this fence. And I want to go about 3/30 seconds up on this, maybe just a little over a 16th inch, a little under 3/30 seconds. So I'm gonna actually, I've got my downside marked. I'm gonna just mark out on here where that is. Carry that line up to here. I'll just do it on the top. So I'm gonna mark out on the top here, 3/30 seconds, a little under, and then I'm going to then just do this by eye instead of trying to get the exact measurement. Now we're going to want to make sure we don't go too deep into our piece of wood here. We don't want to leave that little part on the bottom super thin and dangerously frail. Now my piece of plywood just barely fits the length of these, so I can't go too far in. I'm going to go, well, maybe 3/30 seconds into the piece of wood as well and see if that fits. But when you're going over to it, always make sure to find the very height, the tallest part of your saw blade, and make sure that is exactly where you want to go. You do not want to cut this part so deep that this little thing is barely hanging on there. Be very careful with it, and honestly, if you want, run a test piece through there to make sure you're at the exact depth, because on these kind of delicate little jewelry box trays, it's very easy to go too deep. A long time ago, I made myself a depth gauge just using a T-square and marking all these out. And that allows me, these are all in 30 seconds to get the height right. I'm gonna go probably 3/30 seconds on this as well. So we're gonna line this up on the inside of our mark. And then I'll just run my test cut. I'm just gonna use this piece of pine. This is one of those non-through cuts, so some of you may have to remove your riving knife. Don't do it if you don't have to. I'm going to use a push block and a stick for this, but you could use like a micro jig gripper or whatever. These are very tiny, so they can kind of get a little hard to control, especially if you go even tinier. Just make sure to put good pressure on them. Make sure you've got your downside marked. I like to do my downside on the outside of this to give myself even further room from the fence. Just go through and do the groove, get all of the first ones done, and then we'll move the fence. We're going to go this way. We're going to move the fence inward to nibble away at it, and do all of them through. Each time you move it, check it, then move from there. Don't do one of them, move, one of them, move, one of them, move, because you may forget to do one of them and then have to go back, and it just gets very, very annoying. Okay, so we've got the first one done on all of these. I'm happy with the depth. We're just going to move it over now, a little bit at a time, and we're just going to do the fit until we can get this to be able to slide through there and move just a little bit. We don't want it so that we have to have it perfectly tight, because that could throw off our glue up. We want a little bit of movement, a little bit of room. We're going to pin it with some glue. It'll be fine. It's better to have a little extra room than to not have enough room and have that issue when you're gluing up. If you are making these incredibly short, what you can do, a little trick, is to cut out your tray to the right size and then just remove a little bit on the edge, whether you do it with a sander or taking a nibble off with a table saw. You can make the very edge a little thinner to save you room going in this way. All right, now that we've got all these grooves done, what we're gonna do next, and I'm just gonna do this off camera, you can do this by yourself, is cut these down to size. Leave them just a little loose. You don't want them pushing at all. You don't want it extremely tight in there, just a little loose. We're gonna be pinning them with some glue. They won't move around much anyways. If you're going to stain these like I do, stain them now and let them sit for 24 hours, preferably with a fan. If you use an oil stain and you plan to oil this with like linseed oil or whatever, the area that sits in the groove, if it hasn't dried yet, it will stay moist and the linseed oil will go in there and it will pull it out and it will smear on your pieces. Ask me how I know. I know because it happened. It was awful. And there's no way to really fix it once you've gone that far, and that's a problem. So if you stain this, let this dry. While this is drying, we're also going to do the inside sanding. I'll show a minute or something of this, but I just want to point out that you want to avoid hitting these corners. One thing that makes miters glue up really well is if both pieces on the ends where they connect are even thickness. So when I'm sanding, I either get something very flat and I count my strokes and go both ways to apply even pressure, or if I'm hand sanding, when I come to the edge, I kind of feather up and off. You want to go right up to this edge, but not get the edge. If you start rounding this over, it will have kind of a weird rounded inside gap there. I don't know, it just doesn't look great in my opinion. It's not like a huge fatal flaw. If you do, however, start taking too much thickness off of one side than the other, they won't match up. One will be thinner and it'll want to push back or forward, so be very careful with that. I like to also round the inside edges of these now. It's very hard to do it after because when you've got them glued together, you're running into this corner here. So if you want to put a little round over here, I just use sandpaper. These are so tiny and delicate that putting this through a router would sketch me out. I do the bottom and the top in case somebody's holding the bottom. So just go ahead and do that now. Put a little round over on. Go to whatever grit you want to go to here. I like to get these real soft because it is something somebody may be grabbing and touching. I go from 150 to remove the planer marks to 180, 220, 320, 400, and then steel wool. Now I'm not doing a lot of sanding with each grit, just a little bit each way, and it gets it to the point where the steel wool is almost burnishing it, and it's extremely soft and almost has a glassy look to it, and it works really well. Now if you're going to spray these, you don't have to go that high, just go as high as whatever the manufacturer suggests for your spraying. But I like to oil. I think it's much simpler. It's idiot proof. I like idiot proof stuff. Okay, so just to touch on the sanding real quick, I have some planer marks running here, here, and here that I need to remove. Those are going to take the most sanding, but I don't really have anything too bad over here. So I'm going to start out with 150 grit by hand and just feather in and feather out to remove those. And I'll do that until those grooves are removed. Then I will take 180, lightly go over it, and then I will grab a sanding block, or sometimes I glue entire sheets down, and I will then go like this and do it like that to keep this relatively flat. This is just glued to a 1/4 inch MDF. This is just on 1/2 inch MDF. And then at the very end we get to 400 and maybe even 320 because we don't really need to do a whole lot with that. It goes back to just light swipes. And then when you get to your steel wool, you can actually go at it pretty well. The one thing that can stop me from doing steel wool sometimes is that it becomes very noticeable where you did and didn't do the steel wool. So if you've gone and you're a little problematic over on these ends here and you steel wool in the middle here, there will be a noticeably shinier spot from here to here without in the corners. So take that into consideration when you're sanding, that if you want to get that burnished look, that incredibly almost glass plasticky look just from sanding, that you have to do all of it. You can't just do the middle parts or else the corners will be noticeably more dull, less reflective. All right, we're gonna go ahead and do our glue up now. I'll try to keep this short and sweet. We're gonna need a small paintbrush. You can get a pack of these at Walmart for $5, $6. Some kind of little thing to put your glue on to dab your paintbrush in. This is just a Gatorade top, something to stir. You can also use the paintbrush, but that can get glue all over it. Blue tape or some kind of tape that's not going to mar your wood is pretty strong. A glue that is water soluble, some water, a little mixing cup, our pieces, and our base. We are also going to need some kind of flat surface, whether it's a long straight edge or a square. And you're essentially going to line these up such that we are looking at the outside. All of the downs are that way, and we want the groove facing that way because we are going to tape all of these together, then flip them like this. That will leave the base towards us. We're going to do a dry run first. You're going to tape it all up. You're going to use the base here, put it in, make sure it closes well. In case you cut this wrong and it doesn't fit, you want to know before you put the glue on. We are then going to put glue and water in here. You don't need a ton. These are very small, 2 to 1. I don't know. You want it milky. You want it closer to the substance of water than glue. You are then going to paint that on the end grain. You will start and just do everything until you see it all looking dark. You'll go down and do each one of them. By the time you're done with the last one, you'll probably notice that on the first one, it looks dry again. Paint them again. You want to paint them until they are pretty moist looking everywhere, but not soaking wet. Now, some people let that dry entirely. I don't. Once it's soaked in and I don't see any water left on the surface, but it's clearly moist, I then go ahead and take my normal glue and I paint it on there. Now, one thing to watch out for is that with very small miters, it's very hard to clean up excess glue inside of here. So I highly suggest trying really hard to get the glue amount right so that you don't have a ton of inside squeeze out. And what will generally happen when you fold up is it will press the glue up and towards the inside. So if you're going to put your glue, do just a little bit of the actual glue up here and put a decent amount down here. It will then squeeze itself towards the back, meaning you will get the full coverage, but you are less likely to have a ton of squeeze out. So place more of your glue towards the bottom here and only a little bit, just enough to cover it on the back here. Another tip when we're doing our tape here is we do not want the tape to go over the bottom because we're going to want to sit it flat just to make sure it's relatively flat. When we glue it up, we may need to pull it sideways. So it's okay if some of the tape goes over the top. Because of how small these are, you're not going to be able to see the joints. So you're just going to have to hope you did everything right, and we'll find out later. And if we need to do corrections, aesthetic kind of fixes, we can do that later. So just make sure your tape is not hanging over the bottom. We're going to line up our square. Normally I like to do this on the bottom, but we'll just show it this way. You put your tape on, you push them up against the square, push them together, and just push it on there. That should be good. We will add more tape at the end once we've got them closed. 2 pieces is enough for now. We can add a third one later if we need to. If you do want to put more pieces on later, rip them up or cut them up now so that you're ready when the glue is on there. All right, we're just going to put a squeeze of glue in here. If these are tiny for you, you don't need a ton. You've probably put too much in, that's okay. We're just gonna put some water in there, maybe double, maybe 1.5, I don't know. Just so that it's more watery than it is gluey. Mix it all up so that it's all dissolved in the water. Should be a milky substance that looks like that. It's very runny, it's closer to water. As I said before, we're gonna take our paintbrush. I prefer something with small bristles, and I like actual hair bristles, not plastic ones. Make sure not to get any on the inside of this when you're pulling your brush. If you do, wipe it off quickly and take a little sandpaper and go over it. It will not take any oil if you get glue on there. And it's very hard to correct later because it's so tiny. You'll notice when you push the brush in, the water likes to run up. So don't paint all the way to the top here. Take your brush, just set it there and let the watery glue run up the capillaries of the wood. After you finish the last one, go back to the beginning, hit any dry spots, and then go through and do that for all of them. 2 coats should be all you need. We don't want it sopping wet. We just want the color of the wood to look darker. What this does is it plugs up the end grain just a little bit so that our actual normal glue does not sink too far in to the grain. It provides us kind of a barrier so that our glue is where it normally would be if we were gluing along the long grain or face grain or edge grain. We are also going to spline these, so you don't have to worry too much. Once those are all wet, we're going to apply our normal glue. If you skipped the part earlier, be careful and apply it more towards the end. If you're going to put a decent amount in there, put it more towards the bottom, because when we close, these will squeeze the glue up. So don't put a whole lot at this very top here, or else you will have run out on the inside, and it's very hard to clean on these. After you have finished painting all of these, go back to the beginning and take a look to see if there's still a good amount of glue there. There's a good chance some of this will have sunk in. Go back, repaint it all. We've got, with Type On 3, about 10 minutes, so we're pretty good here. We want to see glue on the surface before we close this thing up, and some of it will sink in. So just go back, paint it again if you need to. All right, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to paint some glue into the groove. Now, if you've used real wood, and that's going to expand some, only put your glue in the middle of the shorter ends. That will pin it essentially to the middle and allow the wood to expand back and forth. If you have plywood, go ahead and apply as much as you want along there. Be careful when you're doing this. This is the last chance to screw it up, so don't do that. Once everything looks good, we're just going to take our base, we're going to insert it into the short side, we're going to fold these over onto each other like so. You can also do this with it laying flat, and sometimes the last one, it's easier to lay it down and pull it flat like this. If you cut these well, everything should line up right. Go ahead and put a few more pieces of tape on any end. Pull from the top down. Just work your way around. If you really want, you can put a whole layer, wrapping the whole thing around almost like a strap. Now let it sit for 24 hours and we'll do the splines. Alright, now that you've got these sanded to about 180 and any gaps filled in and any burnishing over of the edges, we are going to go ahead and do our splines. Now, this is a simple spline jig I used. It's made out of a piece of furniture, side of a bookshelf I found on the street, some MDF, and some old plywood from a cabinet shop that used to be around here and had the best scraps ever. Now, this is very simple. It's just a 45 cut on this piece, 45 cut on this piece, and a 45 cut down the middle. It's quite literally 4 cuts at 45, or actually 3 if you just go down the middle of this and flip them over. It's very simple to build. If I ever remake one, I'll make a video on it, but there are lots of great videos on this. Now, I prefer using this style because I often am using it for big boxes. Mine is kind of a mix between the fence riding and the ones that have a miter bar in it. I like to ride the fence with the kind that normally would be a miter bar, as it allows me a lot more room by referencing it off my fence as to how far out I can go on boxes. A little unorthodox, but it's just my style. Now, the size of your splines, the thickness, is going to be determined by your saw blade and the number of cuts you make. You can make them quite literally any thickness relative to how many cuts you want to make, how many times running it through. I do a single with a full kerf 1/8 inch blade. I just make one pass. I'll show you, if you wanted to make more than one pass, how we'll scoot it over. You're going to need for this some kind of reference clamp block so that you're always putting it at the exact same spot. And then you're going to need your wood, and make sure you have enough of it to go around all of these splines, because even on these small trays I'm putting 2 in each corner, which means I'm going to need 16 pieces of this. Also, make sure the thickness is thicker, or at least as thick as your corner here. We're not going to be going all the way through, but you want to make sure it's thick enough ahead of time so that you're not looking for wood that you don't have. I just want to quickly cover blade choice and the outcome of using a certain blade. Now, the combination blade 50 tooth, even though it has a raker flat tooth, it still leaves these little peaks. However, on the splines, they're barely noticeable, if at all. So this is a fine one to use. Flat top grind, which is on some nicer rip blades, totally flat. Your wood will sit all the way in there. However, on the alternating tooth bevel, which is essentially every other blade other than these two, you get these big peaks. This is exaggerated quite a bit, but your wood will only be able to go to this line, and you will have these little empty gaps here and here. Now, they may not be noticeable, or they may be noticeable enough, and the problem is you either then have to leave them, okay, or fill it in with the color sawdust of the wood that the box is made out of. So you can, strength-wise, these are all fine, but aesthetically, the alternating tooth bevel, which you're going to find on every Diablo blade except the combo blade, and on any blade that's usually 40 tooth, 60 tooth and up, they're alternating tooth bevel. Now, there's also a triple chip grind on some rip blades, but it leaves what can only be described as kind of a slight I don't know, triangle at the top here, and your wood will only sit here. Again, very exaggerated, but you really want to have either the combo blade or the flat top grind, and that will give you the best seat for your piece of wood that we're putting in as the spline. Alright, so this is my spline jig. Like I said, it just references off of the fence, which allows me to have larger boxes if I need to. And the way it works is it essentially allows the blade to just peek through a little bit. This is at a 45 degrees so that we know we are dead center in the box, in the corner of the box. And you're going to want to raise your blade just enough to go through the middle of this, but not through. I mean, it could be an interesting look, but you don't want to cut through so that you're seeing here. So you want to make sure you just raise it a little over halfway through and turn the blade just to really be sure. And I use a clamping method that looks like this somewhat, and clamps go through here. That allows me to reference every cut off of the same position. Now if you're doing more than one spline, and I'm going to do 2 on these even though they're relatively small, just because I think aesthetically it looks better, you have to do a little measurement ahead of time. You're going to have to find your direct center line, make your marks on these, and then line that up on the center here. Now when you're doing your math, really there can be all kinds of different spacing that looks good. 2 really tight in the middle can look okay with a little gap between, or just 2 evenly spaced roughly can look pretty good. Now you can also play around with the angle on this, which will then lead to angled splines coming through, which can look really cool. So that's up to you to play around with. So we're going to now go ahead and spline this. Now I just want to add to the blade height discussion as well, that the blade height will determine how far out your splines go on either side. The deeper you go in, the further out they will go. If you only go shallow, they will only come out a shorter distance. So decide aesthetically as well how far out you want your splines to be, how big you want them to look. Like I said, the deeper you go, the wider out they will get. So the way we're able to get our splines equal distance is by having the measurement of, you just need one of them. Then the stop block allows you to not only flip it around this way and hit each of them, but then to reverse it and hit this side as well. And then these 2 will be equal distance from the edge, which is referenced off of your stop block. Now I want to touch on the fact that if you want kind of a wider spline, maybe you wanted a 1/4 inch, what you would then do is you would cut all of your initial splines, then you would move your stop block, and then cut all of them again. Do not try to cut them each individually. Always reference off of a stop block. I also suggest that you only do the push through. And then if you have a sled like mine, you can either take the sled out or do this. Do not push through and back. If your fence is off at all, just even a little bit, that back pull through will add another little depth in there, and it doesn't look great. So just go through, either pull this off or pull the whole jig around. Presumably yours is probably on a miter bar, so pull this off and then do it the next one. Do not run it back and forth. Okay, so we've got our initial spline here. As you can see, I've got a little waste kind of hanging out here. Do not try to pull this. You can tear the fibers. Get a chisel or get something sharp and just slice it off. Do not yank this thing or else it can pull right out with some other wood fibers. Now that you've got all your spline slots cut, we need to now make the splines themselves that will go in there. Take your good piece of wood and set this aside for a second and grab a piece of scrap that you can just run through a little bit at a time, because test fitting these is a little tricky. You want a fit that is tight, but not so tight that you have to mallet it in there before you get glue in there. Because as soon as you put glue in there, it gets a little more tight, a little more cramped in there, and you may have to mallet, but you want to be able to pull it in and out without a ton of force before you get glue in there. You want it tight, you don't want it wobbling, you don't want it sliding. You preferably don't want to see any gaps when it's in there, but this is a lot of trial and error, and I suggest you take your time and do this really carefully, because if you get to the time when you're putting glue in there and you've cut the spline too large and you're suddenly trying to get it in there, well, malleting a bunch on this tiny little box is not going to be a great idea. At most, you want to have to just do a little tap to get it in there. Now also, when we set up for how wide our splines are, we need to make sure we're cutting it longer than this slot here. because we want to be able to then trim some off the outside and make sure we have no gaps. So we'll go ahead and do the thickness first, and then we'll do the width. I prefer to cut this on the inside of my blade instead of using a thin rip jig, so that I can just go in, test it, cut a little piece off, test fit it, and then go back and forth with using the fence. I find with a thin rip jig, they're not always perfect, and I would not suggest cutting on the inside if you do not have a sacrificial fence. Get a sacrificial fence, melamine, plywood, MDF, whatever, and it'll allow you to get close to that blade without worrying about hitting your nice fence. Now I know that my saw blade is essentially 1/8 of an inch, so I'm going to start at 1/8 of an inch, and generally you'll have to go a little under that, because obviously if it's an identical fit, you're not going to be able to get it in there with glue, because there will then be no space left. So usually I start at 1/8 of an inch, test it, and then just the lightest little tap at a time. Just tappy tap tap until it gets over there and you can fit it right. You don't need to run this whole thing through every time. You can just go in like this, pull it back out carefully. That's why it's nice to have this long. Then I will just take my Japanese pull saw here and just cut it off, test it. If that doesn't work, then I go over, try the other side, and I try all 4 of them, and usually by the 2nd or 3rd time, you've got it right. All right, we are too loose there, so we're going to move the fence away and give it another try. Okay, I've got the right size here, and here's what the proper fit will look like. You got to push it in, but it's not going anywhere. It's not coming out. There are no gaps. You can't see any gaps, and you still have room for glue. Now, if you find when you're gluing up that these are a little tight, grab a piece of sandpaper and just run it over once. Generally, that's all you need, and it will slide right in. All right, now that we've got all of our spline material cut, we want to cut it down into chunks to make this easier. Now, your chunk will need to be at minimum the distance between the 2 exit areas. Now, I would suggest making it a good 1/4 inch bigger on each side, so that when we're putting them in there, we don't have to worry about an exact spacing. You can absolutely do this on the table saw with a crosscut sled or miter gauge. Just make sure to hold them, because the saw blade, if it touches after this is cut, this little thing can go flying. I personally use a small Japanese saw bench hook, and I just cut them very quickly like that. When I'm cutting small pieces, I just like to use the pull saw. It's much more in control. I don't worry about a piece flying. So choose to do it however you want, and cut more than you need. Cut maybe 3 more than you need. Okay, once you've got all of these cut off and they are definitely wider than your spline slot is, cut them out and put them all into a slot so that as we glue, you already know they all fit. Now, like I said, you want to have to push these in, but not have to pound them in ideally, because these are fragile. And a giant mallet blow is not going to be good. If you put glue in there and one is too tight, you've got your spares. Pull it out, don't try to smash it in, go run a spare over a piece of sandpaper just once, and it will generally slide right in. Now, I like to use Type-On 3, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. If you are going to be gap filling, however, consider the glue that dries the clearest, which in my opinion is Gorilla Wood Glue. I don't use it for strength necessarily. I mean, it works quite well, but just be aware of the color that your glue dries so that you don't have gaps with a nasty kind of yellowish glue. Now, I use a pick or this little kind of rubber tipped paintbrush thing from Walmart. I don't know, they sell them at Walmart. And I just paint the glue in there, some on the top, some on the bottom. I'm not trying to be too careful because we are going to finish sand after we cut these off. You'll wait about an hour after you glue these in, and then if you want, you can use a flush trim saw. I personally take them over to the bandsaw, get them pretty close, and then I just sand it flat by running it over a piece of sandpaper. Now, what I will say is be very careful when you cut these off. If you start digging into the outside material here, it's going to require a lot of sanding to get into it. So my advice is don't go closer than you have to unless you know with your flush trim saw that you can absolutely cut it without leaving any saw marks. Now, for the gluing, I like to take out one corner at a time, and I place this one as my top one, this one is my bottom one. I know they both fit going in this way. I glue the one corner, then move to the next. Instead of having them all over the place, I know that all of these fit, So I just need to put them back in. I'd also suggest starting with whatever the bottom, however many splines you have, start with the bottom and work up. It's just much easier that way. So I'm gonna go ahead, just paint the glue in there. You don't want too much, but you just make sure you cover the top and bottom pretty well. Maybe put a little bit on the back wall. And then when you put these in here, you're looking to make sure that you've covered each corner. Now, generally, if there's a little glue squeeze out, that's a good sign. But you don't get long to put it in there and try to move it around if they're tight. So you kind of got to go on the first go, line it up directly even on both sides, and press it in until you feel it hit the back. Now, like I said, be very careful when you're doing this because these are somewhat delicate jewelry box drawers. And when you've got it correct, you'll see a little squeeze out there. You'll feel it seated as you go in. It's just kind of a feel thing you have to get used to for when you can tell that it's hitting evenly. Now I'm going to go ahead with the bandsaw and I'm just going to trim these down. Now remember, you can always do sanding, chiseling, whatever. Don't go so close unless you have a flush trim saw that you trust, that you risk the teeth of a bandsaw or a Japanese normal pull saw going into the side of this. It's just a lot of extra work that you don't want to have to do. So err on the side of safety and leave some meat there, and you can sand it off or chisel it off or whatever. All right, after we've got these sanded down, and at this point I go kind of to an early 220 to get them close. I guarantee these will get marred up, scratched somewhere a little bit, so we don't do our entire finish sanding now. However, this is a good time to take a little sneak peek at what they're gonna look like. You know, one of the fun moments. Just get a little mineral spirits on there and, you know, just fun. It's the little things that are fun for us. But, however, focus. We are now going to cut the internal dividers, and this would be a more kind of personal thing for you as to what you want your segment sizes to be. However, get a piece of scrap so that we can dial in the height of how high our internal dividers are going to be, especially if you have different size trays, which I do. One's about 1/8 of an inch different than the other. So you're essentially, in my opinion, aesthetically, we've got a light roundover in here. I like the top of my dividers to meet the roundover rather than the top of the outside edge here. I don't know, just aesthetic, no functional difference. I just think it looks better that way. So decide early on where the height that you want to match is. If you put the roundover, do you want it on the roundover? If you didn't, then the top is fine. We're gonna take our scrap, and this will be just some nibbling away. We'll just make a light pencil mark where we think we're gonna be, and we'll just start there and see where we're at. I gotta remember this one's for this one and different for that one. Okay, I am dialed in for this tray. I'm gonna see if I can get here what I mean by the height of the roundover. You see that dark space? That's the roundover there, and I like my height to be right as that is kind of ending. It just seems to flow better in my opinion. So I have 2 of these set aside. I know that for each one of them I have one down the middle, and then I'm just gonna do 2 dividers. However, on one of these, they're gonna be equal distance, and on the other, there's gonna be 2 smaller ones on either side and a larger space in the middle. Now take consideration right now of whether you're building this for yourself, for someone, for whoever, what kind of jewelry or items may they keep in here. Now your height obviously is kind of already determined what can fit. Men's watches, maybe if they're pretty small, but cufflinks, rings, earrings, bracelets, necklaces, all of that can go in relatively small ones, and some small women's watches. But think about the size of those things. What kind of area is that going to take up? I like to have different size areas so you can make them all identical, of course. Another thing to consider is with the height in here, if there is a very tiny little item and this is too small, trying to get a finger into here can be real tricky. So make sure you leave enough room that somebody even with kind of larger hands can easily get in there and grab something out. Just we want to plan ahead. Now our general joinery here is we're going to do very simple, just half lapping. And I think that's just the easiest way to do it. You can also do it if you want to put a groove on the inside of these like that and then slide this into there. That's fine. It can look really good as well, but you can't then do them directly across. If you want to have staggered rows on each side, so maybe you want 4 here, 3 here, you're going to have to do it that way because you're obviously not going all the way across. Just aesthetic and sizing decisions that are up to you. I'm just gonna half lap everything, one down the middle, two on either side. Now, you know from earlier that I'm a big fan of test sizing everything with scraps. So I'm gonna get a test piece cut to the distance from end to end that just goes in there but takes a little pressure to go in there. I want it pretty tight, but I don't want it have to be forced in there. Now there's always the option that you make the middle removable. Maybe you want the ability to take a piece out, and that's fine. But in that case, you definitely need to make it loose enough to pull out. We're gonna also eventually be putting glue on here. And if you make it too tight, you definitely won't be able to put any on the end without it squeezing back out. So tight, but not too tight. Now at the beginning of the video, if I remembered to mention this in the intro, there's also the other way of doing jewelry boxes where you put a groove pre-done into these wall border pieces here, in which case everything just slides in. I chose not to go with that for this one. I think it's just a little simpler to go through and do the dividers individually, but I may make a future video, or there are probably other videos, in which case it's much simpler when you get to this part. You already know your exact width across, and you can just proceed that way. I've got my length cut out here, and I just want to give you a visual representation of how tight this should be. I can lift this, but with a little shaking and a little pulling, I can take it out. So it's tight enough that it's not going anywhere on its own. And we will be gluing this, but if you do want to have it removable, you want it tight. I can lift, but it takes a bit. So that's roughly how tight you want these in there. Now, we will also need to do the cross sections the same way. But I want to say now, before we get to cutting the half laps, if you plan to sand these internal dividers, do it before we cut the half laps, because if you cut the half laps to the exact width of the dividers before sanding, they will be loose and a little wobbly when you go to glue them together later. All right, now that you've got these cut out and they fit well, go ahead and sand the top, the bottom, and the outsides here so that when we go to make our half laps, they are at their final width. Now, we will also then be determining our spacing, and you will either have to do some math. I don't do it. I just kind of eyeball it, then move them a little bit using the numbers I have left in order to get your final dimensions. If you want to do the math, go ahead, go for it. All right, I'm just going to go over my cheater way to how I get evenly spaced pieces within a dimension that's not perfect. This is 11 and a 16th and a little over. So that's a very odd number. That's like 11 and 3/32. It's not easy to divide by. And I also have thicknesses here that are not identically even as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, I've got 11. What's 3 ways to divide that, right? So I'll look at it and I'll think, okay, 3.5 gets me to 10.5. That's fine. We start at 10.5. So we go with 3.5, we go in 3.5, in 3.5. And then we put our spacers here and we mark out where that is. We then take what's left in the middle, which is 3 and 3/8. So now I know that I'm an 1/8 away from being evenly spaced. So I need to move each of these back a 1/16 of an inch. And that will get me an even split. So I'll just do that real quickly and then go over the measurements. So we're going to move the outside markers a 1/16 of an inch outside. All right, I've redrawn these, and that gets me to roughly 3 and 7/16 for each of these, because these are both not identical inside, so it's a little wonky. But visually, it's within a 32nd or a 64th of 3 and 7/16 for each of these. So you're going to pick a number which is pretty close to the divisor of whatever this is. You're going to make your mark, you're going to put your 2 pieces, you're going to take this measurement, and whatever the difference is from what you have on either side, you're going to split that in 2 and then move the outside of each of these half of that distance. So it's a little math, but not anything you have to calculate. It's very simple. I hope that makes sense. I really do. It's hard to convey in words, but it works really well. You essentially only have to make a correction once. Now, if you are doing more than 3 spaces, you're going to need to divide it by the number of spacers you're looking to put in there. When I'm only putting in 2, I only have to divide the difference between these 2 in half. 1 for each side. If you're doing 3, you're going to have to divide it into 3, 4, and 4, and so on. Okay, once we've got our marks marked out here, we're just going to take a small square and we're going to copy those on all 3 sides. You're going to also decide which side you want facing up. I happen to like this side. So that means for me, aesthetically, I think the smaller ones going under and the main one across going over is what aesthetically looks best. Which means we'll be cutting out the bottom of the over piece and the top of the under piece. So at this point, I really like to do a lot of marking out, because marking out also allows us to essentially cheat using these in case our measurement of our cut is a little off. We are then able to label, this is going to be left piece, right piece, and then I'm going to label them this way as well. Left, right. So I've got a left piece as well as its left and right, and then a right piece with its left and right. And that way when we put them on the table saw, we can always reference the left side the same. And that way we only have to move the spacer once to cut. And if we are off a little bit, it won't matter because they will still line up perfectly with each other. It's a really helpful tip to avoid having to deal with being a fraction of a 16th off one way or the other if you try to cut these independently. So label them. We got a left and a right on the long one here. We've got a right and a left, and then on each one of these you're going to pick a side, left and right. It's a little complicated. I'm hoping this is coming across in words, and this will ensure, basically just give us protection that if we're a little off on our cut, it still sits nicely in there and evenly. We are going to make the cuts on the main piece first to then reference for these. Now make sure to mark out which side we're going to cut, and we are then going to make a mark for the blade height of our table saw. Now, part of this will depend on what type of blade you're using. If you're using an alternate tooth bevel, your line is going to actually have to be slightly higher where you match up with the tip of the tooth, because they leave that odd kind of V-shaped Dracula fang teeth kind of shape. So the actual flat part will be lower than where the tip of the tooth is. So take into account what type of blade you're using, and it will probably have to be slightly higher than halfway in order to get them to actually sit together nicely. My height here is 5/8, so I'm going to take it down to 5/16 and a little bit more. I'm going to just use a 50 tooth combo blade, so it's still got a little prong tooth on the end, and we're going to account for that. We really want to get this correct from the start, because the more times you have to come back and run it through, you're going to make a mistake and it'll be a little too wide. So we really want to get everything marked out and set up correctly from the start so that we only have to make one go at each of these. It leaves the cleanest look possible. We're now going to take these over to the table saw and we're going to cut out these two bottom pieces. Now, if you are happening to do the cross pieces over, then you're going to cut out from the upper side. It's now time to cut out these initial bottom parts, which these will slot into. You're going to need some kind of stop block, a miter gauge or a crosscut sled, and then just something to clamp if your stop block doesn't auto lock. Now, I personally like to do these one at a time, but if you are very confident that these 2 or 3 or however many you have are exactly the same thickness, you can actually set it up and do one and then just flip it around, and that will be exactly the same spot on either side. I am not 100% confident that these are identical in thickness, so I'm going to do these one at a time. It's a time saver to do it the other way, but I'm not particularly trying to rush and have one of them be too loose. Now, I also like to reference the initial cut on the outside of this marking, and then just have my eating away cuts to get the right fit going internally. What we can do, since we know we want the outside in the same place, is for the very first cut, we can flip it around and do that. Now again, assuming you mark these out correctly, the outside cuts should be in identical positions. Place that marker right on the line, right on, just barely touching the line on the outside of the tooth. Remember, the lines we've drawn on here are the external areas of this piece. So we're cutting right on the line, not the whole line, because these will then fit inside of the lines. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and just make the first cut, and we'll do the flip here if you are doing them equally apart. If you're not, then you will not do this. Right, now the next few cuts we can do with the flip also. The key is just the final few little shavings off cannot be done identically unless you are positive these are identical. So we'll just set it to take away a whole blade length there, maybe a little under, not a blade length, but the width of your blade. And we'll just lock in the stop block. And we'll do that until we get real close. And when you're real close, you should be able to sit this on top, and it almost seems like it's going to go in, but not quite. And then we will individually make our final cut or two. Now on this next one, this will be the last time we flip. We're going to go just a little short of the line, maybe a 64th of an inch, so that we can finesse them individually. You do not want to cut these too large. Cutting them too small is fine. You can always cut it bigger. If they're too large, you can't undo it. Just make sure you're sneaking up with the right-sided one on the right side and the left-sided one on the left side, and keep going until you get a nice fit where you have to press it in there, but you don't have to shove it in there because we're going to eventually put glue in there, and we want some room for the glue to be in there. Okay, so I got mine to the correct width apart. And this is how hard it is to put in. I have to push a little, but not a lot, and it's not coming out anywhere. That is the ideal fit. You do not want to have to be smacking this thing, but when we put it in and end up gluing it, sometimes you do have to do a little tap. But you don't want to have to smack it in now, or else you're never going to get it in with glue in there. So go ahead and just do that for the other one. And there is the final cut on that. You can see how there's no gap on the sides. And you can see here what I'm talking about with the 50-tooth combo blade, where it leaves a little opening space there, which is why we cut a little higher, because that's where the alternating bevel teeth are actually going to the height, but the raker tooth is not going that high. All right, the next part is really simple. If you want the space this way and that way to be even, you're just going to mark out dead center on here, and we're going to be cutting from the top of this side. So whatever your nicest facing side is, that'll be the top. We cut from the bottom on this one, and we're going to cut from the top on this one. Mark it out dead in the center, do the place it over the top in the center, and then trace out where it's going to be. And with these two, we are going to use the flip technique for the entire thing, so that no matter what, whether we're off a little bit or not, they both are equally off, because that will allow it to then sit nicely in here. If you try to do these individually and you are off on this by a little bit, one may be more forward than the other, and that will make it real hard to get in there. So that's my only suggestion, is to do the flip on these. I'll show a second or two of it here. I just wanted to point out too that on these, if these are an odd length, not something easily divisible by 2, just put a dot as close to the center as you can from one side. So I'm at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and like 5 and a little 16ths. So that's 2.5 plus 2.5 16ths. So go 2.5, 1, 2.5. You'll do the same thing from the other side. Mark out 2.5 plus 2.5 16ths. And then directly in the center of those two will be your dead center line. That's the easiest way I know of to get the dead center of an odd length that's not easily divisible by 16ths or 32nds or anything like that. Okay, I realized my camera was not on for any of this cutting the second one, so I'm just going to try to quickly go over how you do it. You're going to start with one line on each side. Because we've labeled these left, left, right, right, just pick a side, left or right, of your markings. Start there. As long as your left and your left are facing inside, these will be identical, and you will not have to worry about any margin of error of your lines. If you try to cut these separately, it's quite possible they will not be perfect if your markings and your lining up with the saw are not perfect. Now, as you get to the end, if you get real close, which I've gotten here, and trying to get exactly that width away on this would be pretty hard, just go over and lightly sand this middle piece until it fits, and that will give you a perfect fit without worrying about overshooting it. I've got to remove a few pencil marks on here anyways, so I'm just going to lightly sand with 220 just by hand, a few swoops, and get it until they sit right in there. Okay, so I sanded these down to fit right in there, sanding the middle piece, and if you've labeled them, both lefts should be facing the same way and the right the same way, and the reason we do that is so that when we stick it in there, it's identically the same from either side. And that leaves us directly down the middle. And any error is going to be so minute that you won't see it. And there you go. Now I personally like to round over the edges of all of these as well. I think just from an aesthetic touch, a sharp edge here, not great. So I round all of that over. And then I also glue up the inside first before gluing it to the base. So after I round that over, give it a light go with 400 grit sandpaper, some quadruple aught steel wool. I will then put the glue on the inside of these joints, put it in there. It'll be locked in place exactly where it's gonna sit. Let the glue dry overnight. Then I come back, I pull it all out, I place glue on the bottom here, and I stick it in. I find that trying to glue them at the same time, it's very difficult to put glue on the bottom, then get these in there, and then put it in without getting glue anywhere. So I just like to do it in 2 stages. Obviously, that's not the most time efficient, but safe, better safe than sorry, because if you get glue run out anywhere in here, if you've stained this, and you plan to oil these trays, that will not take oil, and you'll somehow have to be light sanding here and then restaining. It's a total mess. At this point, we really don't want any glue squeeze out anywhere, so go carefully and try to limit your glue use to only the minimum amount needed. Okay, so when you're going to do your final glue up of the dividers, I just suggest putting a little glue on the bottom, not too much. And then I suggest using a piece of wood on top and on the bottom to press them specifically into the bottom of the tray. I find that seats them best in case your plywood or whatever you're using for the base isn't perfectly flat and they won't naturally sit down in there nice and flat. Just press them onto it and they will glue together really well. Alright, thanks for watching everybody. Have a good one.